April 1967. Friendship, Wisconsin. The auction yard smelled like diesel and wet earth. 70-odd farmers clustered around equipment. Nobody wanted any more. Spring mud caked the tires of flatbed trucks parked in crooked rows along the gravel drive. A farm liquidation sale drew vultures and bargain hunters in equal measure, men who'd seen enough neighbors go under to know opportunity when bankruptcy created it. The auctioneer worked through a John Deere cultivator, a hay rake with bent tines, 36 fence posts still wearing barbed wire. His voice carried across the crowd with practiced rhythm, calling bids nobody rushed to make. Robert Williams stood near the back, 29 years old, sandy blonde hair already receding at the temples. Work had worn grooves into his hands that no amount of washing could erase engine grease permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, boots caked with the same sandy soil that made up his 140 acres south of town. The crowd barely noticed him. Quiet men who farmed marginal ground rarely commanded attention at auctions where money talked and credit talked louder. The auctioneer paused, consulted his clipboard, frowned. He squinted at the last item sitting alone at the edge of the lot, like something even the previous owner had wanted to forget. A 1952 Farmhouse Super M red paint faded to the color of old blood hood propped open to reveal absolutely nothing underneath. No engine, no starter, no generator, no carburetor, just an empty frame and a hollow where the heart of the machine should have been. The thing had sat in a fence row for years, the auctioneer explained to scattered laughter. Someone had pulled the motor back, in God knew when, for God knew what reason. Rain had filled the empty cavity, leaves had piled in, mice had built nests in the transmission housing. A shell. That's all it was. A shell with wheels and a frame International Harvester had built back when Truman was president. "Somebody give me $20 for the scrap iron." The auctioneer's tone suggested he expected nothing and would settle for less. A scrap dealer near the front raised 2 fingers without enthusiasm. "20. Anyone want to make it 25? Silence. The crowd had already moved on mentally, calculating how long until they could get to the grain elevator before it closed. 35. Robert's voice cut through the afternoon stillness, flat and certain. Heads turned. The scrap dealer looked over his shoulder, squinted at Robert like he'd spoken a foreign language, shrugged and dropped his hand. $35 exceeded the value of the metal by at least 10, maybe 15. Nobody wanted to argue with money that made no sense. The auctioneer blinked, marked his sheet, moved on without ceremony. Sold to the Williams farm for $35. Next sale. Thursday, tell your neighbors. The crowd dispersed toward trucks and thermoses of coffee, going cold in cabs. Robert walked to the farmall, ran his hand along the frame rail, traced the bolt holes where an engine had once connected to the transmission bell housing. The steel felt solid under his palm. International Harvester's engineers had built this frame to carry weight and absorb shock across acres of Wisconsin farmland. The fact that somebody had gutted it didn't change what the bones could bear. Christopher White leaned against his brand-new John Deere 4020 30 feet away, arms crossed over a pressed chambray shirt that probably cost more than Robert's entire outfit. Christopher farmed 800 acres of prime bottomland, son of a father who'd bought the right ground at the right time and passed prosperity forward like an inheritance tax. The 4020 beside him gleamed green and yellow in the afternoon sun. $8,200 of factory-fresh machinery still wearing the dealer's stickers. Williams just bought a tin can. Christopher's voice carried the way voices carry when men want an audience. What's he farming with next? A pile of rust? Half a dozen farmers nearby laughed easy laughs that came from belonging to the same world. The world where new equipment meant progress, and used equipment meant compromise, and empty equipment meant failure. Robert ignored them, already calculating angles for loading the farmall onto his flatbed. The shell weighed maybe a third of what a normal tractor weighed, light enough that two men could muscle it up wooden ramps if they had leverage and patience. One of the auction hands helped him for $5, both of them pushing, while the farmall rolled reluctantly forward, wheels seized from years of sitting. 30 minutes later, Robert secured it with chains and drove toward home, the engineless frame sitting behind him like a promise only he could see. The route home passed through Friendship proper, a town that called itself a town mostly out of habit. 3 blocks of storefronts, a grain elevator, a co-op that sold seed and fertilizer and carried debt through winter. The John Deere dealership sat on the north edge showroom windows, displaying tractors most farmers couldn't afford, but all of them wanted. Donald Harris owned the franchise, 45 years old, successful in the way that dealerships made men successful when credit flowed, suit, and farmers kept buying. He stood in the doorway when Robert drove past the engineless farmall, clearly visible on the flatbed. Donald started laughing before Robert's truck even cleared the intersection. The sound echoed off the empty street, harsh and genuine. The kind of laughter that comes from seeing something so absurd it bypasses politeness entirely. He turned toward the parts counter inside, calling to the men sorting invoices. Williams just bought a tractor with no engine. I'm not joking. No engine. The thing is a shell, a tin can with wheels. What's he going to do with it? One of the parts men asked. Farm with it, probably. Donald's grin widened. Man farms 140 acres with junk nobody else would touch. This is just the latest piece of his collection. You can't farm with a tractor that's got no engine. Donald, tell Williams that. See how far you get. By Friday, Adams County had a new joke. Robert Williams bought a tractor with no engine. What's next? A combine with no header, a plow with no blades. The jokes came easy, the way they always do when quiet men do incomprehensible things. Small farming communities run on rhythm and repetition, everyone planting the same crops at the same time with the same equipment bought from the same dealers. Robert's 140 acres of sandy soil and second-hand machinery already marked him as different. Buying a tractor shell for $35 just confirmed what people suspected. He didn't understand how the game worked. But 6 months earlier, October 1966, Robert had found something at Fort McCoy. The Army base sat 40 miles north of Friendship, sprawling across glacial terrain that looked like God had scraped Wisconsin flat and then changed his mind. Fort McCoy hosted military surplus sales twice a year, selling off equipment the government no longer needed or wanted. Farmers had been buying surplus since the end of World War II, back when Jeeps and generators flooded the market at pennies on the dollar. Anything the military considered obsolete could be had for the price of a bid and the effort to haul it home. Robert drove his flatbed truck through the base gates that October morning, past rows of decommissioned vehicles and stacked pallets of canvas tents. He wasn't looking for tents. He wasn't looking for a generator, though generators always drew crowds. He was looking for an engine, specifically a Continental CD193 diesel 4 cylinders, 193 cubic inches of displacement. The kind of industrial diesel the Army mounted in generator sets and air compressors and small utility vehicles nobody outside the military had ever heard of. The Continental sat on a wooden pallet near the back of the lot, still bolted to its mounting frame, covered in Army olive drab paint that had faded to the color of old uniforms. A paper tag wired to the fuel pump read, "Serviceable, removed for unit replacement." The generator it had powered was obsolete. The engine itself remained perfectly functional, pulled only because replacing entire units cost the Army less than maintaining individual components. The military ran on logistics, not sentiment. If a generator failed, they swapped the whole assembly and sold the old one for scrap value. Robert crouched beside the Continental, running his hands over the casting, checking for cracks in the block, examining the injector ports for carbon buildup that would indicate poor maintenance. The engine looked clean. Somebody had cared for it once, changing oil on schedule, keeping filters fresh, treating it like equipment worth preserving. The Army rated it at 48 horsepower, a conservative number designed to account for altitude and temperature extremes and the general chaos of military operations. Robert's father had examined a Continental CD193 at a surplus sale back in 1961, before the cancer took his lungs and his strength and, finally, his life. Kenneth Wright had been a machinist who could read an engine the way other men read newspapers, seeing past factory specifications to the truth hidden in metal and tolerances. That engine makes 55, maybe 60 horsepower if you tune it right. Kenneth's voice echoed across 5 years, memory sharp enough to cut. The Army rates everything low for reliability margins. The real output is higher. The Continental was a diesel which mattered more than horsepower. Diesel fuel cost 22 cents a gallon in Wisconsin gasoline, 35. Diesel engines lasted longer, made more torque at low RPM, pulled harder in sandy soil, where Robert's 140 acres demanded constant work for modest yields. The original Farmhouse Super M had come from the factory with a 264 cubic inch gasoline engine making 44 horsepower at the drawbar. Adequate. Adequate was a word Robert's father had taught him to distrust. Adequate meant settling for what the factory decided you needed instead of imagining what you could build. The bidding started at $50. A contractor from Milwaukee pushed it to $70. Robert went to $85. The contractor hesitated, calculated shipping costs, and the effort of finding a use for a military diesel shook his head. Sold for $85 to the Williams farm. The hammer fell with the finality of inevitability. Robert loaded the Continental himself using a chain hoist borrowed from the surplus yard. The engine weighed maybe 500 pounds, dense and compact, built to military specifications that assumed abuse and demanded durability. He secured it on the flatbed the same way he secured everything, with chains doubled and tensioned, until they hummed when struck. The drive home took an hour flat highway through central Wisconsin, farms rolling past in geometric precision silos and barns, marking property lines older than the families who farmed them. Patricia met him in the yard when he pulled up late afternoon sun, throwing long shadows across gravel, already hardening under the first cold snap of autumn. She was 25 years old, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing dungarees, and one of Robert's old work shirts with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. They'd been married 1 year. She'd quit her teaching job in Friendship the month after the wedding, a decision her family still hadn't forgiven, trading a steady paycheck and summers off for the uncertainty of farming sandy ground with a man who bought his equipment at auctions and surplus sales. "You bought an engine with no tractor." She didn't phrase it as a question. Patricia had learned early in their marriage that Robert's purchases followed logic invisible to most people, but perfectly clear to him. The trick was waiting for the explanation rather than assuming madness. "I'll find the frame." Robert climbed down from the cab, walking to the flatbed, resting one hand on the Continental's valve cover. "This engine is worth 10 times what I paid. Continental charges $1,200 new from the factory. Army threw it away because the generator was obsolete, not because the engine failed." Patricia walked around the flatbed, slowly examining the olive drab paint, the military stenciling still visible on the block. She taught mathematics before she married Robert, taught children to see patterns and solve problems most adults avoided. She'd been good at it, good enough that the school board had offered her a raise to stay good enough that leaving had felt like betrayal to everyone except Robert. He'd understood. Numbers were numbers, whether you taught them to children or applied them to farming. The principles didn't change. $85. She pulled a small notebook from her back pocket, the kind of pocket ledger farmers used to track seed costs and fertilizer applications. Patricia used hers to track everything, every dollar that entered or left their household, every investment and expense logged with the precision of a mathematician who'd found a new problem to solve. She wrote, October 1966, Continental CD193, diesel engine. Military surplus $85. Below that, she added purpose future, tractor conversion. Robert watched her write, watched the careful formation of each number, watched her close the notebook and tuck it back into her pocket. Most farm wives pushed their husbands toward new equipment, toward John Deere dealerships and financing plans that stretched payments across 5 years. Patricia pushed the opposite direction. She'd seen the numbers, understood debt in ways that transcended emotion. Borrowing money meant paying interest. Paying interest meant working to enrich banks instead of yourself. Better to buy tools, she'd told Robert during one of their early conversations about the farm back when they were still courting, and she was trying to understand why a man with a college degree would choose to farm marginal ground. Buy tools, not toys. Tools create value. Toys create debt. The Continental sat on its pallet in the workshop for 6 months waiting. Robert cleaned it during evenings, after chores, stripping away army paint to reveal the metal beneath checking valve clearances, replacing gaskets that had dried during storage. The workshop had been his father's domain once, back when Kenneth Wright was alive and well, and building impossible things from scrap metal and knowledge. It occupied half the barn, insulated and heated with a wood stove that Robert kept burning through winter. A lathe sat against the north wall, belt, driven from an electric motor capable of machining steel to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A milling machine occupied the opposite corner, rebuilt by Kenneth from parts salvaged when a machine shop in Milwaukee went bankrupt during the Depression. welding equipment, a forge tooling that most farmers had never seen and wouldn't recognize if they had. Kenneth Wright had immigrated from Stuttgart, Germany in 1928, 25 years old, with a machinist's apprenticeship and enough money to buy passage to America and nothing else. He'd worked in a machine shop in Milwaukee for 8 months, saving every dollar, sleeping in a boarding house that charged by the week. In 1929, he bought 140 acres of sandy, marginal ground in Adams County for $800, land that better farmers didn't want because the soil couldn't hold water and the yields couldn't sustain debt. Kenneth hadn't needed debt. He'd needed ground cheap enough to own outright space enough to build a workshop, privacy enough to experiment with ideas that factory men would call impossible. His first tractor came together in 1934, assembled from a Model A Ford engine salvaged from a wreck, a truck transmission somebody had thrown into a scrap pile, and a frame Kenneth welded from railroad rails he'd bought for the weight of the iron. It looked like a fever dream, all angles and improvisation, but it plowed straight and pulled hard and didn't break. Kenneth built or rebuilt every piece of machinery on the farm over the next 30 years. Neighbors came from 20 miles away, carrying broken parts and obsolete equipment, asking if Kenneth could make something the dealers said didn't exist anymore. He could. He always could. Robert grew up in that workshop 12 years old when Kenneth first let him touch the lathe, 15 when he learned to lay a weld bead straight and clean, 18 when he understood metallurgy and heat treatment the way most farm kids understood planting dates. Kenneth didn't just teach Robert how to make parts. He taught him how to think about machines, to see a tractor not as a finished product from a factory, but as a collection of systems that could be reimagined, recombined, improved. A factory builds what it can sell. Kenneth's voice, thick with German accent, even after 30 years in America, repeated the phrase like a catechism. A machinist builds what he needs. The factory is limited by profit. The machinist is limited only by what he knows. Kenneth died in 1965 heart attack in the workshop wrench. Still in his hand, oil stains on his shirt that no amount of washing had ever removed. He was 62. Robert was 27, married to Patricia for exactly 8 weeks, still learning to balance the weight of inheritance against the absence of the man who'd taught him everything worth knowing. The 140 acres became Robert's. The workshop became Robert's. Every tool Kenneth had collected across 30 years became Robert's. The way of seeing machines, the way of imagining what could be instead of accepting what was, that became Robert's too. When Robert looked at the engineless Farmhouse Superm sitting on his flatbed that April afternoon in 1967, he didn't see a shell. He saw the best tractor frame International Harvester had ever built. Heavy gauge, steel wide stance for stability in rough ground, bulletproof transmission waiting behind that empty bell housing. The frame was worth saving. The frame was worth everything. All it needed was an engine better than what the factory had installed, an engine that could transform adequate into exceptional. The Continental CD193 was that engine. Robert had known it for 6 months, known it since the moment he'd bolted the diesel to its pallet in his workshop and stood back to imagine the future. 58 horsepower if Kenneth's estimate held true. Diesel fuel at 22 cents, burning a third less than gasoline. Torque curve built for pulling, not speed. everything the farmall frame deserved and nothing the factory had thought to provide. Loading the shell at the auction had taken 30 minutes. Driving it home took another 20, passing the co-op where Donald Harris still stood in his dealership doorway, watching with the expression of a man who'd seen something funny and couldn't quite stop savoring it. Robert didn't wave. Christopher White's John Deere 4020 was long gone, probably already parked in a machine shed bigger than Robert's entire house. The jokes would continue through Sunday, spreading through church parking lots, and grain elevator lines repeated until everyone in the county had heard about Williams buying a tractor with no engine. Patricia stood in the yard when Robert pulled in same spot she'd stood 6 months earlier when the Continental arrived. This time she didn't ask questions. She walked to the flatbed, examined the farmall shell, ran her hand along the frame rail the same way Robert had at the auction. International Harvester built this to last, she said. Her father had farmed back before he'd become a banker in Madison, back when he still understood that durability mattered more than appearance. She could recognize quality metalwork even when the paint had faded and the engine bay sat empty. $35 for the frame. Robert climbed down from the cab, already mentally cataloging the work ahead. $85 for the engine, maybe $40 in steel and gaskets and hardware for the adapter work. Total cost under $200. Patricia pulled out her notebook, flipped to a fresh page, started a new entry. April 1967. Farmall Super M. Frame auction purchase $35. Below that, projected additional costs, adapter fabrication, mounting hardware cooling system, modifications, fuel system, electrical. Estimated $100 to $125. Total project budget $220 to $245. She closed the notebook, looked at Robert with the same expression she'd worn in the mathematics classroom when a student finally grasped a concept everyone else thought too difficult. The numbers made sense to her the same way they made sense to Robert. Christopher White's John Deere 4020 cost $8,200. Donald Harris's showroom was full of machines that required financing most farmers couldn't afford without mortgaging next year's crop. Robert was building something for the price of a good used plow, building it from surplus parts and scrap metal and knowledge his father had spent a lifetime accumulating. Every night after chores, Robert worked in the workshop. The farmall shell occupied the center of the space hood, removed transmission, exposed frame rails, cleaned of rust, and repainted with implement paint that dried flat black. The Continental sat on its pallet beside the shell, waiting for the connection that would marry military surplus to agricultural heritage. The work ahead would take months, Robert knew. Months of measuring and machining, fabricating parts that didn't exist, solving problems the factory had never considered because the factory had never imagined putting a Continental diesel where a gasoline engine belonged. The adapter plate would be first the critical piece that would mate the Continental's block to the Farmall's transmission bell housing. 1-inch thick steel machined to tolerances measured in thousandths, drilled and tapped for bolt patterns that had never been designed to align. 1/1000th of an inch off center, and the drivetrain would vibrate itself to destruction in a single season. Kenneth had taught Robert that precision wasn't optional when metal met metal at rotating speed. Precision was the difference between machinery that worked and machinery that failed. Robert measured both housings, the Continental's block face and the Farmall's bell housing, using calipers accurate to 10,000ths of an inch. He transferred the measurements to graph paper, drawing the adapter plate, full scale, calculating bolt spacing, and pilot bore diameter. The mathematics were straightforward if you understood geometry and didn't rush. Patricia checked his calculations one evening, standing beside him at the workbench, running through the numbers with the same methodical precision she'd used teaching. The math held. The design would work if the execution matched the planning. But what nobody in Adams County understood, what the jokes and the laughter couldn't account for, was that Robert had already built this machine in his mind. He'd assembled it piece by piece during those 6 months while the Continental sat waiting, visualizing every adapter and bracket and modification, solving problems before they emerged, preparing for the work that would prove everyone wrong. The winter of 1967 approached with the inevitability of Wisconsin weather, cold settling into the ground, frost coming earlier each morning. Robert stood in the workshop one November evening, the Farmall shell before him, the Continental beside it, both waiting for the transformation only he could see. The county would keep laughing through Thanksgiving and Christmas and into the new year. Let them laugh. Kenneth had taught him that vindication came from results, not explanations. The numbers didn't lie. The metal didn't care about opinions. The work would speak for itself when spring arrived, and Robert drove something nobody expected. Through fields everyone thought they understood. What he was building wasn't just a tractor. It was proof that a man with knowledge could outbuild a factory with money that surplus and scrap could outperform new, and financed that thinking different mattered more than spending more. The workshop lights burned late that night, and many nights after, casting long shadows across tools his father's hands had worn smooth. Robert worked alone, mostly, though Patricia brought coffee sometimes and stayed to watch, understanding that what happened in this space mattered beyond machinery. Somewhere in the transformation of an empty frame and a surplus engine into something functional and powerful, there existed a larger truth about value and vision, about seeing possibilities where others saw only absence. The Continental diesel waited on its pallet. The Farmall frame waited on its wheels. And Robert Williams, son of a German machinist who'd taught him to build what he needed instead of buying what he was sold, waited for nothing. The work had already begun. November brought frost that turned the workshop windows into sheets of ice by morning. Robert rolled the Farmall shell to the center of the space, positioning it under the overhead work lights Kenneth had installed decades earlier. The Continental diesel sat 3 feet away on its pallet, both machines waiting for the engineering that would make them one. Patricia kept the wood stove burning, feeding it oak splits every few hours, maintaining temperature high enough that steel didn't crack under stress when worked. The incompatibility between Continental and Farmall presented itself in every dimension. Engine mounts designed for generator frames didn't align with tractor rails built for inline sixes. The Continental's bell housing bolt pattern bore no relation to the Farmall's transmission face. Crankshaft flanges measured different diameters, different depths, different everything. A dealership mechanic would have looked at the 2 pieces and declared the job impossible. Factory engineers would have agreed. Nothing about the Continental had been designed to connect with anything International Harvester had ever built. Robert spent the first week just measuring calipers in hand, transferring dimensions from metal to paper with the patience Kenneth had drilled into him starting age 12. The adapter plate would bridge two incompatible worlds, 1 inch of steel machined to mate surfaces never intended to meet. He drew it full scale on butcher paper, spread across the workbench, calculating bolt circle diameters, pilot bore concentricity, face, flatness, tolerances. The Continental's crankshaft would spin at 1,800 revolutions per minute under load. Any misalignment, any wobble, any imperfection in the adapter would manifest as vibration that would destroy bearings and shatter castings within a season. Kenneth's voice echoed through the cold workshop air, German accent thick even in memory. Measure twice, think 3 times, cut once. Steel forgives nothing. Robert ordered the plate material from a steel supplier in Milwaukee, 1-inch hot-rolled mild steel, 12 inches square, delivered to the co-op in Friendship for pickup. Cost $18. He carried it home in the truck bed, the weight of it solid and promising. Back in the workshop, he mounted the blank in the milling machine facing both sides, flat to within 0.02 of an inch, creating parallel surfaces that would mate perfectly to both engine and transmission. The bolt holes came next, 8 of them, arranged in a circle to match the Continental's block face, another 6 positioned to align with the Farmhouse bell housing. Robert drilled pilot holes first, small diameter checking position against his full-scale drawing after each one. Precision at this stage determined everything that followed. He worked with the milling machine's digital readout, a luxury Kenneth had installed in 1962 after cataract surgery made reading dial indicators difficult. Each hole location verified 3 times before Robert committed to the final drill diameter. The pilot bore presented the greatest challenge, a 4-inch diameter opening machined dead center in the plate, sized to accept the Farmall transmission's input shaft bearing while maintaining perfect alignment with the Continental's crankshaft. Robert spent 2 full days boring it, taking light cuts, measuring, constantly checking runout with a dial indicator mounted to the milling machine table. The tolerance window allowed 5/10,000ths of an inch. Robert held it to 3. Patricia tracked expenses in her ledger each evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open beside her coffee cup. November 15, 1967, steel plate blank, 12 by 12 by 1, $18. November 22nd, cutting tools, carbide, insert $6. November 28th, bolt stock grade, $4. The numbers accumulated slowly, each entry representing hours of work compressed into single-line summaries. Robert explained the progress when she asked, describing tolerances and alignments in terms she could visualize even without seeing the metal. She understood precision better than most, understood that mathematics governed everything from classroom geometry to engine assemblies. December arrived with snow that buried the farm under 8 inches of white silence. Robert worked through it, the workshop insulated enough that the wood stove kept temperatures tolerable, if not comfortable. He finished the adapter plate 3 days before Christmas. The final bolt hole tapped and threaded, all dimensions verified against his drawings one last time. The plate weighed maybe 12 pounds, 1 inch of steel machined to specifications that would either work perfectly or fail catastrophically with no middle ground. Test fitting the adapter required help. Robert called to Patricia from the workshop door, breath visible in the cold air between barn and house. She came bundled in Kenneth's old barn coat, too large on her frame, but warm enough for Wisconsin winter. Together, they lifted the Continental, Robert guiding, while Patricia provided muscle from the opposite side, both of them easing the diesel forward until the block face met the adapter plate. Robert threaded bolts, finger-tight, checking alignment by eye first, then with feeler gauges, slipped between surfaces. Everything looked square. He torqued the bolts to specification, working in a star pattern to distribute clamping force evenly. The Continental hung from the adapter now, 500 pounds of diesel engine, cantilevered on 12 pounds of machined steel. Robert jacked up the assembly, rolled it on a shop dolly toward the Farmhouse shell, positioning it carefully behind the transmission bell housing. This was the moment. Either the adapter plate had been machined correctly, or the last 6 weeks of work had produced an expensive mistake. The pilot bore should accept the transmission input shaft, bearing centering the engine on the drivetrain centerline within thousandths of an inch. Robert eased the Continental forward, watching the pilot engage, feeling for binding or resistance that would indicate misalignment. The bearing slid into the pilot bore smoothly, metal kissing metal, with the precision of parts manufactured to fit. He continued pushing until the adapter plate mated flush against the bell housing face. Perfect. Everything aligned. Robert threaded the bell housing bolts, checking runout one final time with a dial indicator mounted to the crankshaft flange. The needle barely moved, staying within the tolerance window Kenneth had taught him to respect. 0.003 inches, total indicated runout. Acceptable. More than acceptable. He stepped back, looking at the assembly as a whole for the first time. A Continental military diesel bolted to a Farmhouse agricultural transmission through an adapter plate that existed nowhere in any parts catalog. The combination looked right, despite being impossible, the engine settling into the Farmhouse frame as though International Harvester had designed the chassis specifically for this application. Patricia stood beside the workbench, watching Robert's face more than the machinery. Success registered there. First, the slight relaxation around his eyes that came when precision work yielded precision results. How close? Her question carried layers of meaning beyond the simple words. She wanted to know margins, tolerances, the distance between success and failure. 0.003 run out. Robert wiped his hands on a shop rag, oil and grease transferring from skin to cloth in familiar patterns. Kenneth would have accepted 5. I'm holding 3. She made a note in her ledger, small and technical, December 22nd, 1967. Adapter plate completed, test fit, successful runout within spec. Below it, another line. Project timeline. 6 weeks elapsed, estimated 12 to 14 weeks remaining, but the calendar proved optimistic. 2 days after Christmas, Robert discovered the problem. He'd moved on to the flywheel adapter, the piece that would connect the Continental's crankshaft to the Farmhouse flywheel and clutch assembly. The Continental's crankshaft flange measured smaller in diameter than the Farmhouse flywheel's center bore, requiring a stepped collar that would bolt to the crankshaft and present the correct diameter for the flywheel. Robert machined the collar from 4-inch diameter steel stock, turning it on the lathe cutting shoulders and bolt circles facing it flat on both sides. The collar bolted to the crankshaft flange without issue. Robert torqued the bolts, then attempted to mount the Farmhouse flywheel to the collar's outer diameter. The flywheel slid on, spun free on the collar for half a revolution, then bound hard. Robert tried again, same result, binding at the same rotational position. He removed the flywheel, examined both surfaces under work light. No obvious defects. Remounted it, rotated by hand, binding at 90 degrees smooth for the next 270, binding again. A pattern. Patterns meant something measurable, something that could be diagnosed and corrected. Robert mounted a dial indicator to the lathe bed, positioned the probe against the flywheel's bore, rotated the assembly slowly by hand. The needle swung through an arc of 6/1000ths of an inch. The flywheel bore wasn't round. Decades of heat cycling and stress had warped it just enough to create high spots that interfered with the collar's outer diameter. He could machine the flywheel bore larger, cutting away the high spots, but that would weaken the flywheel structure and potentially create balance problems worse than the binding. Better to remake the collar, stepping the outer diameter slightly smaller to clear the high spots. Simple in theory. 3 more days of work in practice. Robert dismounted. The collar returned to the lathe, faced off the outer diameter by 5/1000ths of an inch. Test fit again. Binding reduced, but not eliminated. Another 5/1000ths. Better, another 3/1000ths. The flywheel finally spun free through complete rotation, no binding, smooth engagement. But taking 13/1000ths off the collar's diameter meant less material contacting the flywheel, less surface area to transfer torque from crankshaft to clutch. Robert ran calculations at the kitchen table that evening, Patricia reviewing his math while cold wind rattled windows. Torque transfer depended on friction and clamping force. The reduced diameter decreased surface area by roughly 8%. Could the remaining material handle 58 horsepower under load? Kenneth's voice offered no answer. This fell outside his father's experience, outside any reference Robert could consult. Factory engineers would know, but factory engineers would never have attempted the conversion in the first place. Robert made the only decision available: proceed and test carefully, ready to abort if the collar showed signs of slipping. He remachined the collar one final time, balancing the assembly using a fixture he built from an old wheel balancer and a stand made of welded pipe. Balancing a flywheel assembly required patience and precision in equal measure. Robert drilled small weight removal holes in the collar's outer edge, checking balance after each hole, working toward the point where the assembly would spin without vibration at 1800 revolutions per minute. After 14 holes and 6 hours of incremental adjustment, the indicator needle stayed centered within 1/1000th of an inch through complete rotation. Patricia entered the workshop near midnight, carrying coffee in a thermos and concern on her face. "You've been out here 9 hours." Her tone carried observation rather than complaint. She understood what the work demanded, understood that rushing invited failure, more certain than delays. Flywheels balanced. Robert accepted the coffee, poured a cup, drank it black and hot. "But I lost 3 days to a warped bore I should have measured before machining the collar." Kenneth would say, "You learned something." Patricia's observation came from listening to Robert's stories about his father, accumulating second-hand wisdom from a man she'd never met. Try, fail, learn, build better, that's what he taught you. Robert nodded, too tired to argue with truth. The flywheel adapter worked now, balanced and fitted properly, but the detour had cost time, and exposed a fundamental vulnerability in his approach. He was working alone, problem-solving in isolation, making decisions based on theory and hope rather than experience and certainty. Kenneth would have known about flywheel bore warpage. Kenneth would have measured it first, avoided the entire detour. But Kenneth was 5 years dead, his knowledge inaccessible except through memory and lessons incompletely learned. January 1968 froze Wisconsin into landscape that looked carved from ice and iron. Robert fabricated engine mounts from half-inch plate steel welding, mounting pads, to the Farmhouse frame rails, machining rubber-isolated brackets that would position the Continental exactly where the original engine had sat. The mounts had to be strong enough to carry 500 pounds of diesel through decades of vibration and shock, flexible enough to isolate the frame from harmonics that would fatigue metal until cracks appeared. He tested mounting positions by lowering the Continental into the frame, repeatedly adjusting bracket locations by fractions of inches, seeking the configuration that distributed weight evenly across all 4 mounts, while maintaining clearance for the steering linkage and allowing space for the cooling system he'd install later. Kenneth had taught him that mounting engines was more art than science, balancing load paths and vibration modes and thermal expansion in ways that defied pure calculation. The hood presented its own challenge. The Farmhouse sheet metal had been stamped to clear a gasoline engine with a specific height and width. The Continental diesel stood taller, the air cleaner assembly rising high enough that closing the hood would crush it. Robert measured the interference, calculated how much sheet metal would need to be modified. Cutting and welding the hood risked warping thin steel, ruining the fit. Better to fabricate a bulge, a raised section that would clear the air cleaner while maintaining the hood's structural integrity. He formed the bulge from 16-gauge steel, hammering it over a wooden buck he carved from a block of pine, heating the metal with a torch to make it malleable, quenching it with wet rags to lock in the shape. The work took patience and repeated attempts, small adjustments accumulating toward a finished piece that looked almost factory-made. Patricia watched one evening as Robert test-fitted the bulge to the hood, welding it in place with short beads that wouldn't overheat the surrounding metal. "You're building something that doesn't exist in any catalog." Her observation carried weight beyond the obvious. Parts, manufactured to order solutions, fabricated for problems the factory never anticipated. This was the inheritance Kenneth had left, not just tools and workshop space, but the mindset that saw impossibility as invitation rather than obstacle. February brought the fuel system. Diesel required different delivery than gasoline, higher pressure through injector lines that ran from pump to injectors in precise lengths. Robert plumbed the system from scratch, mounting a diesel fuel tank scavenged from a wrecked truck, installing a lift pump, and filters rated for the Continental's fuel flow requirements. The injector lines he fabricated himself, bending steel tubing to route around obstacles, flaring the ends, testing for leaks with compressed air, before committing to final installation. The cooling system demanded attention next. The Continental produced more heat than the original gasoline engine, requiring a larger radiator to dissipate the extra thermal load. Robert found a radiator from a scrapped International KB7 truck at a salvage yard in Wisconsin Rapids, oversized for a tractor, but perfect for the application. Cost $15. He fabricated mounting brackets from steel strap, positioned the radiator in the farmall's nose, plumbed it with hoses and pipe fittings assembled from parts bins and surplus stores. The electrical system came last wiring glow plugs and a heavy-duty starter capable of cranking the Continental's high compression through Wisconsin cold. Robert ran wire through the farmall's original conduit, where possible drilling, new holes where necessary, soldering connections, and wrapping them with friction tape that wouldn't degrade in engine heat. Each system required testing and isolation before final assembly, checking voltage drops and current draw and resistance values against specifications. Robert had to derive from first principles because no manual existed for this combination of components. Brandon Thompson appeared in late February, 19 years old, thin from a winter where farm work had been scarce and meals scarcer. Robert found him standing in the workshop doorway one Saturday morning, hands jammed in coat pockets, breath visible in air, still cold despite the wood stove burning inside. "Heard you're building something." Brandon's voice carried the uncertainty of a young man asking permission to exist in someone else's space. "Can I watch?" Robert studied him for a moment, seeing past shabby clothes and nervous energy to something more familiar. Kenneth had let Robert watch at 12 years old, teaching through demonstration rather than lecture. The knowledge had to pass forward or die with the generation that carried it. "You can do more than watch," Robert gestured toward the farmall, "but you do exactly what I tell you, exactly how I tell you. No shortcuts, no assumptions." Brandon nodded, entered the workshop like someone crossing into territory previously forbidden. Robert set him to organizing tools first, cleaning workbenches, tasks that required attention and revealed attitude. Brandon worked methodically, asking questions about tool names and functions, absorbing information with the hunger of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Over the next month, Brandon became a regular presence, showing up after his own chores, staying late into evenings, learning to sweep metal shavings and hand Robert tools by name, and eventually to run simple operations on the lathe under close supervision. Robert taught him the way Kenneth had taught, through demonstration and correction and gradual increases in responsibility. Patricia brought extra food some evenings, sandwiches and thermoses of soup, feeding both men while they worked through problems that couldn't wait for normal meal schedules. Brandon machined mounting brackets for the fuel tank under Robert's direction, learning to measure with calipers, to set up the milling machine, to check work against drawings with the precision metalworking demanded. The brackets weren't critical components, nothing that would cause catastrophic failure if tolerances ran slightly loose, but they required the same attention Kenneth would have demanded for any piece. Either work was done right, or it wasn't done at all. By early March, the Farmall Super M had transformed from empty shell to nearly complete machine. The Continental diesel sat mounted in the frame adapter plate, connecting engine to transmission flywheel and clutch assembly installed and adjusted. Fuel system plumbed and tested, cooling system pressure checked for leaks, electrical system wired and verified, hood modified and fitted. Every system that could be tested without starting the engine had been tested, checked, verified against standards Robert had established from factory manuals, and Kenneth's teaching and his own evolving understanding of how disparate components became coherent machinery. The project had consumed 4 months, November through February and into March. Patricia's ledger recorded the financial progression, steel and welding rod fuel system components, radiator and hoses, electrical parts, hardware and fasteners, and miscellaneous supplies. Total expenditure beyond the original engine and frame, $88. Combined with the $35 for the tractor and $85 for the Continental, the complete project stood at $208. Christopher White's John Deere 4020 had cost $8,200. Donald Harris's showroom remained full of machines requiring financing most farmers couldn't afford without mortgaging the future. Robert had built an alternative for $208, and 4 months of evening work knowledge Kenneth had passed forward, transformed into metal and diesel and the promise of vindication. March 15th dawned clear and cold temperatures, hovering just above freezing ground, still hard from winter, but showing patches of mud where sun had worked its slow spring magic. Robert filled the Continental with oil-checked levels and pressures, verified that every connection had been tightened to specification. Patricia stood near the workbench, Brandon beside her, both watching as Robert climbed into the operator's seat for the first time since the project began. The seat felt right, positioned at the correct height and distance from controls, the Farmhouse ergonomics unchanged despite the transformation beneath the hood. Robert turned the key to accessory position, watching as the oil pressure gauge climbed to 0, normal. He engaged the glow plugs, preheating the combustion chambers for 30 seconds. The Continental's compression ratio demanded it, cold diesel refusing to ignite without help. Key to start. The starter motor engaged with a grinding whine, spinning the Continental's crankshaft through compression strokes that resisted the effort. The engine turned over slowly, reluctantly, cold oil thick and draggy in tight clearances. Nothing caught. Robert released the key, waited 10 seconds, tried again. The starter spun. The engine turned, and on the 4th compression stroke, something changed. The Continental coughed. Once, coughed again, caught and held. Diesel clatter filled the workshop, deeper and harsher than any Farmall had ever sounded military, surplus growling through agricultural sheet metal. The exhaust note was wrong, fundamentally wrong for a tractor, too diesel and too authoritative, and too much like equipment that belonged on battlefields rather than farmland. But the engine ran smoothly, settled into an idle that vibrated the frame within acceptable limits. Oil pressure climbing to specification, coolant temperature starting its slow rise toward operating range. Robert let it warm for 10 minutes, monitoring gauges, listening for sounds that would indicate problems. The Continental idled without complaint, burning diesel at a rate so low the fuel gauge barely moved. He blipped the throttle, watching the engine respond cleanly, RPM rising and falling with the governor's control. Everything felt right. Everything sounded right, despite sounding completely wrong. Patricia's hand rested on Brandon's shoulder, both of them standing motionless, watching history being made in a workshop that smelled of diesel smoke and hot metal. Robert shut down the engine, climbed from the seat, turned to face them with an expression that revealed nothing and everything. It runs. 2 words, flat delivery, containing months of work and Kenneth's entire legacy compressed into a statement of fact that required no elaboration. The field test came 3 days later, after Robert had run the Continental through heat cycles and load tests in the workshop, verifying that all systems functioned under stress. He hitched a four-bottom plow to the farmall, the same plow his father had pulled with various machines over 30 years of farming. The original Super M, with its gasoline engine, could handle 3 bottoms in the sandy soil without lugging down. 4 bottoms exceeded its capacity, requiring reduced ground speed that made plowing inefficient. Robert drove the diesel Super M to the south field, 40 acres of sandy loam waiting for spring planting. Neighbors worked their own ground in the distance, tractors visible as colored dots moving in systematic patterns across brown earth. Robert dropped all 4 bottoms, opened the throttle. Halfway, engaged the clutch. The Continental diesel pulled all 4 plow bottoms through sand that should have stopped it, pulled them like the ground offered no resistance worth mentioning. Diesel torque at low RPM, the characteristic that made these engines valuable for industrial applications, translated into pulling power that transformed adequate into exceptional. Robert increased throttle slightly, testing limits. The farmall accelerated all 4 bottoms, turning soil at a pace the original gas engine could never have maintained. Sound traveled across Wisconsin farmland the way sound travels across open water, carrying farther than seemed possible, announcing presence through auditory signature, unique and unmistakable. The Continental's diesel clatter reached neighboring farms within minutes, a growl that belonged to military equipment or heavy construction machinery completely foreign to the gasoline symphony farmers expected from tractors. Christopher White stood at his fence line, 2 farms over, listening to a sound that made no sense in agricultural context. His John Deere 4020 idled behind him, expensive and new, and suddenly less impressive than it had been 10 minutes earlier. The Williams farm was pulling a 4-bottom plow through that sandy ground, pulling it with ease, and the engine making those impossible sounds was something Christopher couldn't identify or explain. By week's end, 5 different farmers had driven past the Williams place, slowing to watch Robert work the diesel Super M through fields that should have required lighter equipment. They watched, drove home, said nothing to their wives or neighbors, because saying something would require explaining what they'd seen, and explanation required admitting that Robert Williams had built something they hadn't imagined possible. Donald Harris heard about it Friday afternoon at the co-op, 3 farmers telling variations of the same story. Williams put a diesel in that farmall. Military surplus engine. Thing sounds like a tank and pulls like a caterpillar. Impossible. Farmalls don't take diesel conversions. Nobody makes adapter kits for Continental motors. The story can't be real. But Saturday morning, Donald drove past the Williams farm, timing his route to coincide with field work he knew would be happening. The diesel Super M sat parked near the barn hood. Up Robert bent over the engine bay, doing something Donald couldn't identify from road distance. Donald slowed, debating whether curiosity outweighed dignity, whether looking would seem like admitting he'd been wrong about the tractor shell he'd mocked back in April. Curiosity won. Donald pulled into the drive parked beside the barn, walked over to where Robert was changing the Continental's oil filter. The diesel took a different filter than the original engine, requiring an adapter Robert had machined to accept the military specification part. The tractor sat with its hood propped open, the Continental clearly visible, unmistakably not the gasoline engine International Harvester had installed at the factory. That's a Continental CD 193. Donald's voice carried surprise despite his attempt at professional neutrality. Military surplus diesel In a Super M frame. Robert glanced up, wrench in hand, expression revealing nothing. That's right. Donald walked around the farmhouse, slowly examining modifications that shouldn't exist. The adapter plate between engine and transmission, precisely machined, bolted tight with grade 8 hardware. The engine mounts fabricated from plate steel, isolating the Continental's vibration from the frame. The modified hood with its bulge to clear the diesel's air cleaner. The fuel system completely reworked for diesel delivery. The cooling system upgraded beyond original specification. He crouched beneath the tractor, studying the adapter plate from below, running his fingers along weld beads that looked factory clean, checking bolt torque by feel, examining work he would have sworn impossible if he wasn't touching it with his own hands. 15 minutes passed while Donald investigated Patricia, watching from the house window, Robert continuing his oil change without acknowledging the inspection. When Donald finally stood brushing dirt from his pants, his expression had changed from skepticism to something approaching respect. A dealer recognizing craftsmanship that exceeded what his franchise could provide. This is factory-quality work, Williams. Better than factory. The tolerances on that adapter plate, the way you balance the flywheel, the mount isolation. This is professional engineering. My father taught me. Robert threaded the new oil filter into place, torqued it by hand until resistance built to specification. Kenneth Wright, best machinist Adams County ever had. Your father was legendary. Donald had sent customers to Kenneth back in the 50s and 60s, farmers needing parts the dealers couldn't source, obsolete components that existed nowhere except in Kenneth's imagination and skill set. I didn't know he'd taught you all this. Robert wiped his hands, looked at Donald directly for the first time since the dealer had arrived. He taught me that a factory builds what it can sell. A machinist builds what he needs. The words hung in cold spring air, challenge and philosophy combined, statement of principle that explained everything about the $208 tractor that outperformed machines costing 40 times more. How much power is that Continental making? Donald's question came from genuine curiosity, now dealer instincts calculating performance against inventory. I figure about 58 horsepower at the drawbar. Factory rates it 48, but the Army underrates everything for reliability margins. My father examined one in 61, said it was good for 55 to 60 if tuned right. He was right. 58 horsepower. Donald did the math automatically, comparing against the original Super M's 44. On gasoline at 35 cents a gallon. This runs on diesel at 22. More power, cheaper fuel, longer engine life. And I paid. Donald paused, almost afraid to ask. $35 for the tractor frame, $85 for the engine, maybe $88 in steel and parts and hardware. Call it $208 total. Donald Harris had sold John Deere tractors for 20 years, built a comfortable living from financing and markups and the steady progression of farmers who believed newer meant better. He was looking at a machine that outperformed half his current inventory, built in a barn for the price of a good used plow, built by a farmer who understood metal and mathematics better than most engineers carrying degrees from state universities. I'm not going to sell you a John Deere, am I? The question carried resignation rather than hope. Probably not. Robert closed the hood, Latched, it stood back to examine the completed machine in full daylight. The farmall looked almost normal with the hood down, red paint faded, but serviceable wheels and frame, showing age, but no defeat. Only the exhaust note would reveal what lived beneath that sheet metal diesel growl, announcing difference the moment the engine fired. Donald drove home without stopping at other farms, without sharing what he'd seen with the parts countermen who'd laughed last April when Williams bought a tractor shell for $35. For the first time in his career as a dealer, Donald Harris had nothing to say that wouldn't sound like admission of something he wasn't ready to admit. The diesel Super M worked the Williams farm through April and May, planting corn in straight rows, pulling cultivators and discs and implements the original engine would have struggled to move. Robert logged hours in Patricia's careful ledger notation, tracking performance and fuel consumption and maintenance requirements with the same precision she'd applied to construction costs. The Continental burned exactly as much diesel as Kenneth had predicted, delivered exactly the horsepower calculations had promised, required nothing more than scheduled oil changes and filter replacements. By June, 3 neighboring farmers had approached Robert quietly, asking variations of the same question: "Could you do this to my tractor?" Small operators farming marginal groundmen who couldn't afford Donald's inventory but needed reliable machinery to stay viable. Robert quoted them prices between $200 and $400, depending on complexity, told them to source their own frames, promised nothing except honest work at fair rates. The first conversion job came in July, a Farmall H, with a blown engine, the frame still good, but the tractor otherwise headed for scrap. Robert found a small Perkins diesel at an industrial auction, built another adapter plate on the milling machine. Kenneth had left him, completed the conversion in 3 weeks of evening work. The farmer paid $250 and drove away with a machine that would run another 20 years. The diesel Super M logged 4,000 hours between 1968 and 1975 without major repair, Continental engine burning cheap fuel, and asking nothing except scheduled maintenance. Robert performed himself. Other farmers noticed. Small operators working marginal groundmen who understood that survival depended more on low costs than high yields started appearing at the Williams farm with questions that all reduced to the same essential inquiry. "Can you make my old equipment competitive again?" Robert quoted. "Honest prices. $250 for a simple conversion, $400 if the work required extensive fabrication, or if the farmer wanted additional modifications beyond basic engine replacement. Each job had demanded custom engineering adapter plates machined to specifications that existed nowhere except in drawings Robert created for single applications. No two conversions followed identical paths. A Farmall 5.6, with a turbocharged Continental, required different solutions than a Farmall 4.6, accepting a smaller, naturally aspirated diesel. The mathematics changed. The metalwork changed. Only the underlying principles remained constant. Brandon helped with the simpler tasks by 1972, machining brackets and fabricating mounts under Robert's supervision, learning through repetition what Kenneth had taught through demonstration. The boy had developed into a capable assistant, steady hands, and patient temperament, making him valuable in ways that transcended mere labor. Robert paid him from conversion income fair wages for honest work enough that Brandon could save toward goals Robert didn't inquire about, but Patricia tracked in mental ledgers separate from the farm accounts. By 1974, Brandon could complete basic conversions with minimal oversight, Robert checking critical dimensions but trusting the younger man's growing competence with routine fabrication. The workshop had become a teaching environment again, Kenneth's legacy extending through Robert to another generation, knowledge passing forward the way it had to pass or die entirely. Patricia maintained separate accounting for the conversion business, tracking income and expenses in columns that demonstrated profitability most small businesses would envy. Parts cost remained minimal, engines sourced from military surplus and industrial salvage yards at prices representing scrap value rather than functional machinery. Robert's labor commanded premium rates because the work defied conventional categorization, existing somewhere between mechanical repair and custom engineering, neither service readily available through normal agricultural channels. The conversion income added $15,000 to $20,000 across those years, money that accumulated in savings accounts, earning modest interest, building toward opportunities Patricia could envision, but Robert didn't yet recognize. She understood numbers in ways that transcended basic arithmetic, saw patterns in financial data the same way Robert saw patterns in machinery. Their combined skills created synergy neither could have achieved alone, metal and mathematics converging toward outcomes their individual capabilities would have missed. Donald Harris started sending customers to Robert in 1976, a decision that surprised everyone who understood dealership economics. Men walked into his showroom looking for used tractors, budgets too tight for new equipment, financing too risky given uncertain crop prices. Donald listened to their requirements, calculated what his inventory could provide, then made referrals that cost him commissions. "I can't help you for under $3,000. His pitch varied slightly depending on specific customer needs, but followed consistent logic. "But there's a man south of town who can, Robert Williams. He'll build you a tractor from surplus parts for a quarter of what I'd charge, and it'll run better than most of what's on my lot." The referrals baffled his parts counter staff men who'd spent careers believing that sending customers to competitors violated fundamental business principles. Donald understood something they didn't. A farmer helped even by redirection was a farmer who remembered. That farmer might return in 5 years with cash for new equipment, choosing Donald's dealership because Donald had earned trust when times were tight. The long game paid better than the immediate sale, relationship building, offering returns that transcended quarterly commissions. Christopher White heard about the referrals through county gossip that traveled faster than seed catalogs and with less accuracy. He confronted Donald at the co-op one afternoon, voice carrying the indignation of someone whose worldview required defending. "You're killing your own business," Christopher gestured toward Donald's dealership, visible through plate glass windows. Showroom full of green and yellow machinery, representing hundreds of thousands in inventory. "Sending customers to Williams costs you sales. I'm building relationships." Donald's response came without heat or defensiveness. Simple statement of strategy. Christopher couldn't parse through his own framework of competition and acquisition. Something you wouldn't understand. Christopher walked away, convinced Donald had lost perspective. Probably age-related cognitive decline, definitely poor business judgment. His own operation was expanding, third new tractor purchased on credit in 4 years, land acquisitions financed through loans secured against equipment and future crops. The bank encouraged such leveraging, interest rates still manageable in the mid-70s, land values rising fast enough that borrowing to buy acreage seemed like capturing free money. Christopher's net worth existed primarily on paper assets minus liabilities, producing positive numbers that felt like wealth but required constant cash flow to maintain. Robert's savings grew through the opposite mechanism, income exceeding expenses by margins that compounded through Patricia's careful management. Farm profits remained modest, sandy soil, yielding 80 to 90 bushels of corn per acre. Nothing spectacular, but adequate, given zero debt and minimal overhead. The diesel Super M burned 22-cent fuel, required almost no repairs, pulled implements the original gasoline engine could never have managed. When corn prices fluctuated, Robert's costs remained flat. When diesel prices rose, the Continental's efficiency offset increases through reduced consumption. Laura Clark was born in 1970, arriving in April during planting season, Robert missing the birth because a neighbor's tractor had broken down during critical field work, and honor demanded helping before attending to personal matters. Patricia forgave him before he asked, understanding that farming communities survived through reciprocal assistance that couldn't be scheduled around convenience. Laura grew up in the workshop the way Robert had grown up there, learning to hand tools by name before she could write those names in cursive. By age 10, Laura could identify every piece of equipment in Kenneth's collection, could explain basic lathe operation, understood that tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch determined whether machinery worked or failed. Patricia taught her mathematics at the kitchen table, while Robert taught her metalworking in the barn, both parents recognizing that their daughter's education extended beyond what schools could provide. The knowledge Kenneth had brought from Stuttgart in 1928 was entering its third American generation, immigrant wisdom, filtered through Depression-era pragmatism and post-war ingenuity, reaching toward futures none of them could predict, but all of them were building. The late 70s brought prosperity to Wisconsin, agriculture, corn prices, climbing past $3 per bushel. Land values soaring as farmers expanded operations and banks encouraged leveraging. The boom felt permanent to those who'd never experienced the inevitable contraction following every agricultural expansion cycle. Younger farmers, particularly those who'd started during good years and knew nothing else, borrowed aggressively against appreciating assets, financing equipment purchases, and land acquisitions that assumed current conditions would persist indefinitely. Christopher White exemplified the pattern, his operation growing from 800 acres to 1,200 between 1977 and 1980, financed through loans that seemed prudent when corn sold for $3.50 and land appreciated 15% annually. He bought his fourth new tractor in 1979, John Deere 4440, with power beyond anything his acreage actually required, financed over 5 years at 12% interest. The monthly payments exceeded what many farmers earned in good months, but Christopher's gross revenue supported the obligation comfortably as long as corn prices held and yields maintained historical averages. Robert watched the expansion from his 140 acres. Patricia's warnings about debt cycles echoing Kenneth's Depression-era caution about borrowing against uncertain futures. They'd been offered financing repeatedly, banks eager to lend against land that carried no mortgage and a farm showing consistent profitability. Patricia declined every offer, sometimes gently, sometimes with the mathematical precision that demonstrated exactly how debt service would consume revenue previously available for savings. "You're thinking too small." The bank manager who'd approached them in 1979 couldn't understand their refusal. "You're sitting on $65,000 in savings, earning 5% interest. You could borrow $200,000 at 12%, buy 400 acres, triple your operation." That's how you build wealth in farming. "We're thinking long term." Patricia's response came from understanding that banks profited from debt, regardless of whether borrowers succeeded or failed. Farmers who borrowed big and won paid decades of interest. Farmers who borrowed big and lost simply transferred land ownership to lenders who'd risked nothing except money created through fractional reserve banking. Interest rates began climbing in 1980. Federal Reserve tightening money supply to combat inflation that threatened the entire economy. 12% became 15, 15 became 18. Farmers who'd borrowed at 12 suddenly faced refinancing at rates that doubled their debt service, while corn prices started falling from artificial highs that had assumed perpetual growth. $3.50 per bushel became $3, then $2.50, then $2. Land values that had seemed permanently elevated began declining slowly at first, then with acceleration that turned leveraged prosperity into over-leveraged catastrophe. Christopher White's operation, designed for $3 corn and 12% interest, couldn't function at $2 corn and 18% rates. His equity evaporated as land values fell below outstanding loan balances, transforming paper wealth into real insolvency. The bank that had encouraged his expansion suddenly demanded he reduce debt, sell assets, demonstrate viability, or face foreclosure. Similar conversations were happening across Adams County, across Wisconsin, across the entire Midwest Corn Belt, where a generation of farmers discovered that leverage worked both directions. Robert's costs remained unchanged because they'd never been predicated on optimistic assumptions. The Continental diesel burned the same cheap fuel regardless of interest rates. The 140 acres owed nothing to any bank. When corn dropped to $1.75, Robert tightened his belt, the same belt he'd been wearing since 1968, and kept farming. The workshop still generated conversion income, though demand decreased as farmers facing foreclosure stopped investing in equipment they might not own next season. Patricia's ledgers showed declining revenue but persistent profitability, the kind of resilience that came from building on foundations that couldn't be repossessed. Adams County lost 6 farms between 1982 and 1986, families that had worked the same ground for generations, forced out by debt they'd accumulated during good years and couldn't service through bad. The human cost was real, neighbors losing homes and livelihoods, children watching parents surrender to forces that felt more like weather than economics, inevitable and impersonal. Robert attended the auctions when he could, bearing witness to dissolution, remembering that every catastrophe created opportunities for those positioned to capitalize without celebrating suffering. The Krieger place went to auction fall of 1984, 180 acres adjoining Robert's east fence. Similar sandy soil, yielding similar modest returns, worth owning at the right price, and worthless at the inflated values banks had pretended were sustainable. The farm family had borrowed against appreciation, refinanced at higher rates, finally collapsed under debt service that consumed more than gross revenue could provide. The bank took possession, scheduled liquidation, started bidding at $200 per acre to establish a floor below which they wouldn't accept offers. Auction day arrived cold and clear, October weather that felt more like November. Farmers bundled in jackets and ball caps, standing in clusters that spoke in low voices about shared catastrophe. The crowd understood they were watching their own potential futures, one bad season, or 1 percentage point, separating security from foreclosure. Robert stood near the back, Patricia beside him, both of them knowing what they intended before the auctioneer opened bidding. 200 per acre. The bank's opening figure represented roughly half what the land had sold for 3 years earlier, depreciation that felt like theft to farmers who'd bought at peak prices and now owed more than their ground was worth. Robert raised his hand. 240. A speculator from Milwaukee, young man in clean coveralls that had never seen field work, pushed the price. 280. Robert didn't hesitate. 310. The speculator paused, calculating. Milwaukee money bought investment properties at foreclosure prices, flipped them to recovering markets, extracted profit from other people's disasters. But 310 per acre approached the threshold where returns diminished, especially for ground that would require work before generating income. The speculator lowered his hand, conceding to someone willing to pay more than distressed value. The auctioneer confirmed the bid, established payment terms. $310 per acre, 180 acres, total price $55,800. Cash sale, no financing. The crowd went silent with the recognition that happens when expectations shatter. Everyone knew Robert Williams farmed 140 acres with old equipment and military surplus conversions. Nobody knew he'd accumulated cash reserves sufficient to purchase nearly 200 acres without involving banks. The silence carried weight beyond surprise collective realization that the man they'd dismissed as small-time and old-fashioned had survived the boom and positioned himself to profit from the bust while they were all drowning in debt they couldn't service. Christopher White stood at the edge of the crowd watching Robert write a check most farmers couldn't have covered if they'd liquidated everything they owned. Christopher's own farm was scheduled for auction in 6 months. Another family, being ground between interest rates and commodity prices, another operation that had looked prosperous on paper, but had built prosperity on borrowed money that now demanded repayment. The bitterness on Christopher's face was visible from across the lot, anger at Robert or at himself, or at the system that allowed both outcomes from similar starting conditions. Donald Harris attended the auction as observer rather than participant dealer presence, documenting the contraction of his customer base. When Robert's name was announced as buyer, Donald walked over, waiting while Robert finished paperwork with the bank representative overseeing the sale. $55,000 cash from the man who builds tractors out of Army surplus and scrap frames. Donald's voice carried observation rather than judgment, professional assessment of an outcome he should have predicted years earlier. Robert folded the deed, slipped it into his jacket pocket without ceremony. That's right. Donald removed his cap, rubbed his forehead, looked at the crowd dispersing toward trucks and uncertainty. I've been selling John Deere's 20 years. Selling progress, selling horsepower, selling the future. And the man who showed up with an engineless Farmall for $35 is the one buying land at auction, while my customers are the ones selling it. Your customers bought on credit. Robert's response came without malice or triumph, simple statement of divergent strategies that had produced divergent outcomes. I built from scrap. There's a difference. The difference is about $55,000 and zero payments. Donald extended his hand gesture, carrying respect hard-won through watching Robert prove every assumption wrong. I owe you an apology. I laughed at that Farmall in '67, called it a tin can, told everybody you were crazy. You sent me customers in '76. Robert shook the offered hand, acknowledging the pivot that had cost Donald commissions, but had built the kind of respect that transcended business transactions. I remember that. Least I could do. You were building better machines than I was selling. Took me a while to admit it, but I knew it by '75. They stood in the auction yard, dealer and builder-seller of new machines and maker of impossible ones, sharing recognition that success could be measured in ways financial statements didn't capture. Donald had built a business, selling what factories produced. Robert had built a life creating what factories wouldn't imagine. Both paths generated income. Only one generated independence. Christopher White's farm went to auction spring of 1985, 500 acres and equipment, and the house he'd grown up in, all of it liquidated to satisfy debt that exceeded asset values. He lost everything except the knowledge that he'd gambled on leverage and lost a lesson that came too late and cost too much. Robert heard about the auction but didn't attend, witnessing Christopher's dissolution, feeling too much like profiting from suffering even when the suffering was self-inflicted. But Christopher appeared at the Williams farm 2 weeks later, evening light failing across fields. Robert was preparing for planting. Christopher stood beside his truck, thinner than Robert remembered, wearing the defeated posture of a man whose identity had been wrapped in acreage and equipment he no longer owned. Robert walked over from the barn, grease on his hands, from maintaining the Continental decades of diesel service, still requiring nothing more than routine care. The words came hard for Christopher, pride-fighting necessity, invisible conflict. I need work. The admission cost him. Robert could see, it could feel the weight of humiliation Christopher carried like physical load. Anything. I'll do anything. Robert studied him, seeing past anger and resentment to something more fundamental. Christopher had been raised to believe that bigger meant better, that expansion proved success, that borrowing was simply accelerating inevitable prosperity. The system had taught him those lessons, and the system had been wrong. But the wrongness didn't make Christopher stupid or lazy or deserving of the poverty that foreclosure had delivered. I'm managing 320 acres now. Robert gestured toward fields that had doubled since the Krieger purchase. I need help. Fair wage, you can live in the hired hand house. Christopher's surprise registered physically, posture straightening slightly, some of the defeat lifting. Why would you help me? Because a man's worth isn't in what he owns. Robert had learned that from Kenneth, had absorbed it through childhood, spent watching his father value knowledge over possessions. It's in what he can build. The offer wasn't charity. Robert genuinely needed help managing expanded acreage while maintaining the workshop and conversion business. Christopher could run equipment, understood field work, would earn his wages through honest labor. But the offer also represented something larger demonstration that failure didn't have to be permanent, that falling didn't preclude standing up again. Kenneth would have made the same offer. Patricia, when Robert told her that evening, approved immediately. Christopher worked the Williams farm for 5 years, learning humility through repetition, discovering that satisfaction could come from work, divorced from ownership. He saved money. Patricia helped him budget, lived simply in the hired-hand house, rebuilt finances from nothing with the same patience Robert had applied to building the diesel Superam. By 1990, Christopher had accumulated enough to purchase 40 acres small operation, but paid for entirely in cash. No debt, no vulnerability to interest rate fluctuations or commodity price swings. The transformation from competitive antagonist to humble employee to small-scale independent operator took Christopher through lessons that should have been taught before he'd borrowed himself into oblivion. He remained grateful in ways that manifested through actions rather than words, helping Robert when equipment failed or weather-threatened crops, reciprocating assistance that had arrived when Christopher had needed it most. The county watched the evolution, drawing conclusions about character and redemption that conversations couldn't have taught as effectively as demonstration. Laura was 18 in 1988, high school senior, with her mother's mathematical precision and her father's mechanical intuition combination that made her formidable in ways teachers struggled to channel through conventional curricula. She wanted to build her own conversion project. Senior year, independent study that would satisfy graduation requirements while teaching skills no classroom could provide. Robert agreed on condition she do the work herself, guidance permitted, but hands-off construction required. She found a 1948 Farmall Cub at an estate auction. Smallest tractor International Harvester had produced, designed for vegetable farms and small acreage operations. The Cub's original engine had seized, rendering the machine worthless to most buyers, but perfect for Laura's purposes. She bid $40 won without competition, trailered it home on a borrowed hauler. The conversion took 6 months of evening and weekend work, Laura machining an adapter plate on Kenneth's lathe, learning to measure tolerances and check runout and verify alignment through repetition that built competence. Robert watched from the workbench where he was fabricating brackets for a customer's conversion, offering suggestions. When Laura encountered problems, but refusing to do work she could accomplish herself. Patricia tracked expenses the same way she'd tracked Robert's original project ledger entries, documenting materials and parts, and the educational value that transcended dollar figures. The small diesel engine came from a retired generator set at a Madison Industrial Surplus Yard, 22 horsepower, rated but probably capable of 25, given military underrating tendencies. Laura plumbed fuel system and cooling and electrical with the same methodical progression Robert had followed 20 years earlier. When the Cub fired up on first attempt, running smoothly on diesel fuel, pulling a small plow through garden soil, Robert experienced the same vindication Kenneth must have felt watching Robert complete his first major project. "Your grandfather would approve." The words carried weight beyond simple praise. connecting Laura to a man she'd never met, but whose legacy she was extending into Generation 3. Kenneth's knowledge, filtered through Robert's teaching, manifested in Laura's hands immigrant wisdom becoming American persistence, becoming family tradition. Robert handed the farm to Laura in 1994, age 56, still healthy, but ready to shift focus toward the workshop that had always been his real passion. Laura was 24, married to an engineer from Madison, combination of agricultural experience and technical training that positioned her to manage the 320 acres Robert had accumulated through patience and opportunistic purchases. She farmed with mixture of modern and converted equipment, the diesel Super M still functioning after 26 years, Continental engine that the Army had discarded, outlasting machines costing 40 times more. The workshop continued operating, Laura's husband helping with complex conversions, while Laura managed field work and Patricia tracked finances for both enterprises. Brandon had moved on years earlier, saved enough to buy 80 acres north of Friendship's small operation he farmed debt-free, using lessons Robert had taught. The knowledge kept spreading, rippling outward from Kenneth's original workshop through generations and students and customers who'd learned that building beat borrowing when timescales extended beyond quarterly earnings. Adams County Historical Society contacted Robert in 1998 asking to display the diesel Super M at the County Fair Agricultural Exhibit, showcasing local innovation and historical equipment. Robert agreed on one condition, a sign explaining construction costs. The society accepted, understanding that numbers told stories, words couldn't improve. The sign, Robert wrote himself, simple black letters on white background, 1952, Farmhouse Super M. Diesel conversion, tractor frame, $35. Continental CD 193, diesel, engine, military surplus, $85. Adapter plate, mounts hardware, $88. Total cost, $208. Hours logged, 22,000 plus. Performance, 58 horsepower, 4-bottom plow capacity, still in farm use, built by Robert Williams. Kenneth Wright's workshop, winter, 1967 to 68. Kenneth Wright, master machinist, 1903 to 1965. Fair day arrived warm and clear, August afternoon with humidity that made thinking difficult, but didn't stop farmers from examining equipment that represented their own histories. The diesel Super M sat on display between a restored John Deere Model A and a Minneapolis Moline that somebody had painted colors too bright for agricultural authenticity. Robert stood nearby, not promoting or explaining, just available for questions that came in steady progression through the afternoon. Young farmers photographed the sign, wrote down specifications, asked if conversions were still possible, given modern equipment and emission regulations. Robert answered honestly possible if you understood metallurgy and had access to machining tools and didn't mind that dealers wouldn't service what you'd built. Most people wanted easy solutions, turnkey answers, warranties that transferred responsibility to manufacturers. The kind of work Robert did, the kind Kenneth had taught him, required accepting that building your own solutions meant owning your own failures. Donald Harris arrived mid-afternoon, retired 8 years, but still attending county events from habit and genuine interest. He was 72, walking with a cane that resulted from a tractor rollover that had almost killed him in 1992. Retirement had given him perspective on a career spent selling equipment most farmers hadn't needed, financing dreams that had trapped more people than it had liberated. He stood before the sign for several minutes, reading numbers he already knew, processing implications that had taken decades to fully comprehend. $208. Donald's voice carried the weight of someone calculating opportunity costs across entire career. I sold 4020s for 7,400, 4430s for 28,000, 4640s for 45,000, and this $208 pile of surplus and scrap outlasted and outworked every one of them. Robert stood beside Donald, both men regarding machinery that had become more symbol than tractor representation of philosophical divide between building and buying, between creating value and consuming it. Not outperformed. Your John Deeres were fine machines. I just didn't need them. Nobody needed them. Donald's reflection emerged from retirement perspective, distance creating clarity that had been impossible during active sales years. That's what I think about now. Nobody needed the horsepower I was selling. They needed what you were building. Enough machine to do the job paid for in cash, running on cheap fuel built to last. That's what farming actually requires. Everything else is just... Donald gestured vaguely at air, searching for word that captured excessive consumption marketed as progress. Extra. Robert nodded, understanding that Donald's admission cost him nothing economically, but something significant personally. Dealers weren't villains. They sold what manufacturers produced within systems designed to prioritize profit over utility. But systems could be circumvented by individuals who understood that factories built what they could sell, while machinists built what they needed. Kenneth had recognized that truth in 1928. Robert had internalized it by 1967. Laura was teaching it to her own son, 8 years old, in 1998, learning to hand tools and measure tolerances in the same workshop where Kenneth had taught Robert and Robert had taught Laura. My father used to say that a factory builds what it can sell. Robert quoted Kenneth in English, though the original lessons had come in German-accented phrases, immigrant wisdom filtered through language barriers, but losing nothing essential in translation. A machinist builds what he needs. Your father was right. Donald shifted weight off his injured leg, leaning heavier on the cane. He usually was. The fair continued through evening lights coming on as sunset approached, families arriving for 4-H shows and carnival rides that had nothing to do with agriculture, but everything to do with community. Robert remained by the diesel Super M answering questions, explaining construction, occasionally demonstrating starting procedure when someone wanted to hear the Continental growl to life. The engine fired reliably 31 years after Robert had first cranked it in his workshop, burning diesel that cost more than 22 cents now, but still cheaper than gasoline, still producing torque. That exceeded what any factory would have installed in a Farmhouse frame. Laura's son approached, as light failed 8 years old and curious about the tractor his mother drove during planting season. The boy had Robert's sandy blonde hair, Patricia's mathematical precision already evident in how he organized questions into logical progression. He examined the sign, read numbers. He was just learning to comprehend in educational context, looked up at Robert with expression that combined curiosity and something approaching reverence. "Grandpa, could I build something like this someday?" The question carried weight beyond childish inquiry, reflected understanding that building represented option. Most people never considered alternative to buying that required knowledge and tools and willingness to risk failure. Robert knelt down, meeting his grandson's eyes at level height, recognizing the same hunger he'd felt at similar age when Kenneth had first let him touch the lathe. "Can you see what could be instead of what is?" The boy considered processing question that adults would have dismissed as rhetorical, but that children understood required honest assessment. "I think so." "Then, yes." Robert's answer came with certainty. Kenneth would have approved commitment to passing knowledge forward, regardless of whether economic systems valued such transmission. You can build anything. The county fair closed at 10, lights switching off in sections, crowds dispersing toward parking lots and home farms, and lives that continued independent of exhibitions and displays. Robert loaded the diesel Super M onto his trailer, securing it with chains he'd used for 30 years, driving home through darkness that felt familiar and comforting. The workshop lights were visible from the road. Laura or her husband working late on some project Robert would hear about tomorrow. The knowledge Kenneth had brought from Stuttgart in 1928 was entering its fourth American generation, continuing because it had to continue, because alternative was letting factory logic dictate possibilities. Robert parked the trailer, walked to the workshop, found Laura fabricating brackets for a customer's conversion. Third-generation Wright, working Kenneth's tools, maintaining tradition that measured value in durability and function, rather than novelty and debt. She looked up when Robert entered, smiled, returned to welding without needing to explain what she was building or why it mattered. The Continental diesel that had cost $85 in 1966 had logged over 22,000 hours on an adapter plate Robert had machined to tolerances factories claimed weren't necessary for agricultural applications. The Farmhouse frame that had sold for $35 when everyone else saw worthless scrap had carried that diesel through 3 decades of Wisconsin farming, pulling implements and generating income, and demonstrating that seeing possibilities mattered more than accepting limitations. $208 an Army engine, a machinist's son. Everything else had just been waiting to be built, metal and mathematics, and Kenneth's voice across the years, saying what Robert now told Laura and what Laura would tell her son, that men who build what they need will always outlast men who buy what they're sold. That knowledge weighs nothing and costs nothing and compounds across generations in ways money never can. That the distance between empty frame and functional machinery is measured not in dollars but in willingness to imagine what could be.